Okay, so hello and welcome to today's AEMS Expert Talk, the second AEMS Expert Talk ever, actually. And this time it's on economic growth versus climate change, how we can prosper within the boundaries of the planet. So I hope you are as excited as I am for the discussion today with our two great panelists, Professor Helga Kromp-Kolb and also Professor Peter Victor. So I am Haliki. I'm Haliki Kainen. I am your moderator, but also a research and teaching associate at the Ecological Economics Institute at the Vienna University of Economics. I am also one of the organizing team members of the Alternative Economic and Monetary Systems Summer School. So I can't see how many people are here already. If you can hear me and you can see me, then congratulations, you've passed the first hurdle, and you can see and hear. The second hurdle is then to figure out how you can post questions and take part in the polls during the talk. So on your right-hand side, you should see two tabs. There's event and there's session. And you can ignore event completely. So please do not click on the event. And Helga is already here. Hi, Helga. And under the session tab, you then have different options. We will only be using Slido both for the questions and for the polls. So you can ignore the Umfragen. And the chat function is open, but we will only use that if you have any IT problems. So please, focus your questions on Slido. And to get you warmed up and participating, I hope Petra is here, helping me in the background. We already have a poll for you ready. And I will just wait for that to come up. In the meantime, perfect, it's there now. So you can type in where you are joining us from tonight. So a city, a country, a continent, as you wish. And while you type in your answers, I will type in my answer as well. I'm in Vienna. Okay, we see that Vienna is kind of winning. Oh, there's also Estonia, great. That's a little shout out from me. While you type in your answers, I will quickly run you through the plan for today. So after I finish talking here today about Hopin, Karina Kampner from AEMS will then quickly come on stage to tell you about the two summer schools. After that, I will jump in again and introduce you to the topic quite briefly. And then I will also introduce our first speaker, Professor Helga Kromp-Kolb. And Helga will then give a brief input presentation on the topic, which will be followed by a brief input by Professor Peter Victor. And then after those two inputs, we will open the discussion for the Q&A together. And another really brief note, there is an option for you to share your screen, not your screen, sorry, your video and your microphone. Please don't do that for now, unless you're Peter Victor or Helga Kromp-Kolb, because that will be used for the Q&A session. So I will ignore all your requests to run on stage until we come to the Q&A. Great. I hope you can see the answers now to the poll. We also have people joining us from Belgium, South Korea, Munich, Sweden, St. Petersburg, France, Italy, pretty exciting stuff. Okay, and I hope you are a little bit more familiar now with Hopin, and I pass it on to Karina, who's already here. Great, take it away.
Thank you very much, Haliki. A very warm welcome from my side. I'm Karina. I'm the project manager of the Alternative Economic and Monetary Systems Summer School. Together with the Academy for the Common Good, we organized this expert talk series. And we do that because sustainability is a thing very close to our heart. We really want to include sustainability in all of our actions. I work with the ÖAD student housing. We are a non-profit organization, and our main business is to accommodate students and professors in Austria. We accommodate them in eco-friendly student dormitories, and over 60% of our own student dormitories are built in the passive house standard, which is a very energy efficient standard. We accommodate about 10,000 persons a year, and in our energy efficient dormitories. We also have 2 summer universities, the Green Building Solutions. It's a master level program that's all about passive house building, construction, sustainable urban planning, innovative architecture, and it invites students from the fields of architecture, construction, engineering, and similar fields. And we also have the Alternative Economic and Monetary Systems Summer University. That's directed to everybody who is interested in alternatives to the current economic and monetary systems. Topics include the limits of growth, the climate crisis, the instabilities of the financial market, and ways out of all these crises, and like strategies for socioeconomic transformation. Next week, actually, we're gonna have an open house day for everybody who is interested in the summer universities. And we're gonna explain a little bit about the summer universities, about the topics, and then we go straight away into Q&A sessions. And one more announcement, we're gonna have our next expert talk on 1st of April. It's about circular economy from waste to wonder. So I'm gonna put the links to these events also in the chat, so you can have a look online also. Okay, then I hand back to Haliki.
Okay, and I am back as promised. I also made it. So welcome again to our talk today, and I will now briefly introduce the topic. So economic growth versus climate change. How can we prosper within the boundaries of the planet? Despite having knowledge of the material limits to growth for some 50 years now, we have continued to grow our economies exponentially to the detriment of the environment. More than 50% of historic carbon emissions have happened in my lifetime. So that's in the last 30 years or so, in case you didn't know how old I was. This is due to our economic system, which must keep growing year on year to keep employment levels high and to pay for the welfare states of the global north through taxation. And our comfortable lifestyles and high consumption in the global north actually rests on the shoulders of the global south. And unfortunately, all this added consumption in the global north has not even added to increased social well-being since the 1980s. While increasingly limiting the environmental and material space citizens in the global south have to meet their basic needs in the future. On our current climate trajectory, we are heading for disaster. In other words, our economic system is at war with the Earth's carrying capacity. We need a radical carbon climb down in the overconsuming global north and a reduction in materials use in the economy by design, or it will happen by disaster, as Peter Victor says. Bringing our civilization back within planetary boundaries is going to require that we liberate ourselves from our dependence on economic growth. But is this possible? And how do we do this without disaster? Well, the beautiful planet on which we live is abundant in resources, enough for all of us to have a good life, to meet our material needs comfortably, if we live a slower, less resource and productivity intensive and community-oriented lifestyle. Yet how do we get there? And how do we get off the treadmill of growth? Okay, so this was a very brief introduction now from my side. And I am looking forward to discussing these issues in more detail with our 2 brilliant and accomplished experts, Professor Helga Kromp-Kolb and Professor Peter Victor. Neither of them really require an introduction, but I will give them one anyway, and I will start with Professor Helga Kromp-Kolb. And Helga, you can already join us now if you would like. So hello. Professor Kromp-Kolb is one of the foremost Austrian meteorologists and climate scientists, and she quite often appears in different public discussions in media, newspapers, and events as an expert on climate change. So you might have seen her already, and especially on the human causes of climate change. So she has also been named the Austrian Scientist of the Year, and she has fought for climate action for quite some time now. Helga has been the university professor for meteorology, it's a difficult word, at the Department of Water, Atmosphere and Environment at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences, so BOKU if you're Austrian, since 1995, and there she also sits on the University Senate. Helga is also the co-founder of the Climate Change Center Austria, the CCCA, which since its founding has been a key contact point for research, politics, media, and the general public for all questions relating to climate research in Austria. Okay, so I hope that was enough. If I missed anything, then feel free to add. So the floor is yours, and I will now leave you.
Thank you very much, Haliki. I think that was more than enough. Because it's not about me, it's about climate and it's about economic growth. And I will now try to share my screen with you. I'm not quite sure it will work, but we have a backup system, but nevertheless, I will try whether I can manage this. So I think I will have to ask Karina to please share her screen, and I will just say next when I need the next slide. Okay?
Okay.
So. Thank you very much. I see the screen. I hope everybody else also sees it. It's about this the general topic, but maybe you can go on to the next one immediately. Next. Thank you. I think it's quite obvious. We're living in a global ecosystem, and we're part of this global ecosystem. And if the ecosystem is threatened, so are we as humans. So I think it's an interaction between planet as a global ecosystem, society, and humans. If the planet is under pressure, for instance, through climate change or through biodiversity loss, this puts society under pressure, social disruptions and similar things. And that again puts people under pressure. And one of the issues where the planet is under pressure is corona, for instance, which then causes an individual health problem. Next. We can look at the global ecosystem as a closed system. The only thing that we really get from the outside, apart from a few meteorites every now and then, is solar energy. And most of that solar energy, again, leaves the system. It's just a very small part that is really used. It's used for the plants to grow. It's used for the climate system to evolve. And we use some of it, for instance, in solar energy or wind energy or water energy. All of that is driven by the sun. But what we use, a lot of the things we use for everyday life, for our subsystem of this global ecosystem, for our socio-economic subsystem, is all sorts of things like materials, minerals, food, and so on. And we're extracting all of that faster and more of it than the planet can replenish in the same time. And that's the one part. We're overusing the sources. On the other hand, we're also dumping things, more things and faster, and things is also gases like carbon dioxide, more than the planet can recycle and reuse, and in qualities that it cannot handle at all, like, for instance, plastics. Next, please. The rate at which we're doing these things is exponential. I don't want to go into details, but you can see all of these curves show exponential growth, essentially since about the end of the Second World War, 1950 or so. Please go on to the next one. And in 1972, next slide, please. In 1972, the Club of Rome, and click once more, please. The Club of Rome published its study on limits to growth. And one of the essential results in that study is that in a limited system, exponential growth leads to overshoot and then to the collapse of the system. And looking back on the scenarios they developed in 1972, it shows that essentially we're on track for the business as usual for the reference scenario that they developed at that time. So after 40 years, we're still moving along the track towards overshoot and collapse. Next, please. Now, if we look at a more recent study, and what are the limits? Where does this? Where are the limits of growth or the limits of interaction of humans with the system? We see this here in a graph that has become very popular, I believe, by Stefan et al. The inner blue circle sort of encloses the area where the interactions we have with the planet or with the ecosystem can be handled. This is the part where the system is resilient. If our interactions exceed the red circle, we're quite sure that we're in the high risk area where we really endanger that system. And in between, it's sort of a question mark. We're not quite sure how far are we. Science cannot fully tell whether how the boundaries are defined. Now, if we focus on climate change, the boundaries here are defined by greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. Next picture, please. But of course, we could also look at boundaries that are defined by temperature, for instance. What you see here is the global temperature rise since the 1880s or so, and you can see that the rise is quite considerable, and the last few years, those last dots up there, are even above the linear increase that has occurred since about 1970. And the question is how far can this increase go, and we can still handle it? How hot can it get, and humans can still survive in that surroundings? Maybe not humans, but at least our civilization. The next graph, please. There are other limits as well. So one is the acceptable heat. Humans are a heat engine, and we need some sort of cooling. So if the surroundings are too hot, we have a problem in surviving. But there's also the question on acceptable loss of land through, for instance, sea level rise, the acceptable loss of forests through forest fires, for instance, the acceptable migration in the social sense. How much migration can we really handle? And there's a lot of other limits that obviously are there, but that are quite difficult to define. However, before any of those are reached, the climate system might be getting out of control. Now, I wouldn't claim that it is in control now, but there's a worse state than we have now. We now still have the impression that our greenhouse gas emissions decide on the speed of temperature rise, for instance, or the extent of temperature rise. If, however, we cross certain tipping points, then we possibly can no longer stabilize climate. And these tipping points are self-enhancing feedback processes that once they have started, continue on their own without human actions reinforcing them all the time. They are just within the natural system. They can accelerate. So the question is, can we still stabilize the climate, and up to which point can we stabilize the climate? The scientific answer so far is about at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We're quite sure that we can still stabilize, but anything that's beyond 2, we're really not certain. And this can be maybe pictured in the way I show here. Towards the left, it's colder. Towards the right, it gets warmer. And you see the Earth sort of oscillated between the cold part, the ice ages, and the warmer parts, the warmer period we're in now, for instance. And the energy needed for this oscillation, or the disturbance from outside that caused the oscillation, was astronomical issues like the path of the Earth around the sun and so on. What we're now doing is we're disturbing the system by putting in additional greenhouse gases, and we're moving the climate towards the hotter side. And what we don't know is how far we are on that path. Are we already above this, the peak, and it only goes towards hotter and hotter? And the danger is, if we're on that path, or if we're already on the slope downwards, that means we're in something which we call hothouse Earth, which means it will warm on its own without human further interference and without our being able to stop it. So this is the real issue and the real urgency of the matter, to make sure that we do not get into this situation. Next, please. And the decision whether we will or not will be taken within this decade. So if we don't want to get there, can we stay within the boundaries, those 1.5 degrees, for instance? What is necessary to really stay within those boundaries? And the nice thing about it is that the transformations needed are transformations that can really bring significant improvements. If we look at the agricultural and the food system, for instance, if we go back to healthier food because it uses less pesticides, because it uses less meat, there's more vegetables, more grains, more fruit. If it's generically produced, this is something we need to do for climate, but it is also something which helps us improve our health. It also helps farmers in stabilizing their crops, because soil with more humus in it, with more fertile soil, is also more resilient against climate change, like too much rain or too little rain. You have similar things in the mobility system. If we change the mobility system towards more walking, bicycle riding, public transport, we get cleaner cities, less loud cities, we get fewer accidents, we get more community, and at the same time, less costs. So here again, change towards staying within the boundaries by using less energy, emitting fewer greenhouse gases, is also a change towards a more agreeable life. And I can go on with that, looking at circular economy, share economy, not having to own everything, but just making use of it when you need it. We need considerable changes in the monetary and financial system, and that the financial system, the way it is now, is not really helping in questions of equity and fairness, is very obvious to everyone, I believe. I think we also need considerable changes in the educational and the science system, but all of these changes are not something for the worse, they're really something for the better. So we can really flourish within those boundaries. It's not something we sort of have to make do with, it's something we really should be wanting. And we look at the next one, just a few examples. This is a picture of a family in Chad, and they have lined up before them what they need to feed the family for one whole week. And if you look at that, it's some grains, it's a little bit of fruit, it's a lot of water. And if you compare that with the next slide, which shows the same array for a family in Germany, and Austria will not be very different, you can see it's a completely different style of living, and yet the humans are the same. So the needs are one thing, and the lifestyle is a different thing. And obviously, you would want the family in Chad to have maybe a little bit more variety, a little bit more of everything. But quite obviously, this family does not need all of that. And most of us in the industrialized nations do not need all of that we're really using now, and that we're being pushed towards using by our economic system. We can look at this in a more scientific manner as well. If we look at the next slide, this is the land area. I'm sorry, this is in German, but never mind. The top one is sort of the brown part is the land area, the global land area. And if we look at the yellow part, is sort of that part of the land area that is inhabitable. And of that, about half is used for agricultural purposes. And if we then look how much of that is used to produce meat, you can see that is about 2/3 more. It's 77% of that land area, of the agricultural area, is used to produce meat. And yet these 77% of the area only produce about 1/3 of the proteins we need and only 70% of the calories we need. So obviously it's a very inefficient way. And at the same time, doctors tell us it's not healthy. So if we reduce meat production, we're doing something for climate, we're doing something for health, we're doing something for efficient use of land, and so on. The next slide is just another aspect. This is for the European Union. It shows what percentage of the materials we use is being recycled. So how close are we to a circular economy? Well, the only part that is being recycled is that little loop below. That's about 10%. So 10% of the materials we use are being recycled, which means about 90% are just partly go into stock, but to a large part, they are also just wasted. So you can see it's not really about making do with less. It's about going about using our things in a more efficient, in a more reasonable manner, in reusing, repairing, reusing, and so on. So again, this is not something to be afraid of. It's really something to be looking forward to. And finally, this is one of the big questions. What you can see here is sort of based on the donut economy by Kate Raworth. Where are the different countries? On the bottom line, it's the biophysical boundaries that are transgressed. And you can see there's quite a few countries in the left-hand corner that don't transgress many of these biophysical boundaries. They are quite within their limits. And in the vertical axis, you see the social boundaries or the social thresholds that you would like to reach. And you can see most of these countries don't reach those thresholds. But on the other hand, we have the countries in the right-hand top. Those are countries that reach the social thresholds, but they exceed biophysical thresholds by far, or many of the biophysical thresholds. And where we really all should be is that star on the left-hand, in the left-hand top. And what this graph really shows quite clearly that we need different paths for different countries. If you click once, you can see that these countries in the left-hand corner, they need to move upwards in terms of social thresholds, reach social thresholds. On the other hand, the industrialized nations on the right hand, again, if you click, we have to move to the left. We have to decrease our biophysical resource use. And these are completely different pathways that are necessary. And if we go to the, I think it's the last slide, if we continue, the question is now, how can we initiate that changes and who will initiate that change? Are the governments in a position to lead? Hopefully they are, but it is not certain, especially if you consider Ortwin Wren's analysis that says that the steering processes, the central steering processes of the economy and politics have become insufficient and ineffective. And the question is, if not the governments, if the governments are not the ones who can lead that because they are too much entangled with economy or whatever, who is it? Who is it? Is it science? Is it popular force? Who is it that can really initiate and pull through that change? I think that is one of the issues that we might discuss afterwards. Thank you very much for your attention. Just click once more. That is the final slide. Thank you. I think I can give it back over to Haliki now.
Hello, I had a little moment of panic there, but it worked and I am back. So that's good. Thank you very much, Helga, for your excellent inputs. We now move on to Professor Peter Victor, and I will also give you a drum roll introduction, if that's okay. Peter's already here. Great to see you. So Peter also doesn't need a big introduction, but I will give you one anyway. Professor Peter Victor is an award-winning Professor Emeritus in Environmental Studies at York University in Toronto, Canada. And he's also chair of Ontario's Greenbelt Council, a member of the board of the David Suzuki Foundation and the Center for the Advancement of Steady State Economics. Oh no, you already disappeared again. Okay, hope you come back soon. And Peter is also one of the most well-known ecological economists in the field, and certainly one of my big academic heroes. And he's been recognized through multiple awards. He has been awarded with the Milestone Prize in the Social Sciences and the Boulding Memorial Prize from the International Society for Ecological Economics. And he was also elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2015. And Peter, don't be shy, you can come back on if you're ready. And he's mostly or very well known for his groundbreaking bestseller, written together with Tim Jackson, who's another ecological economics superstar. And this book is called Managing Without Growth, Slower by Design, Not Disaster. And the book came out in 2009 and was updated for a 10-year anniversary with new material in 2019. Okay, Peter, I hope you come back because I have finished my very speedy drum roll introduction. So hi, sorry about that. We seem to be having a little technical difficulty, but Helga, maybe you can come back on and we can answer some of the questions that have been posed. And then hopefully Peter will join us for his presentation.
I'm trying. I'm trying, but somehow I couldn't manage either. I think I'd like to take one question because many of them are very economic, so I think it would be better for Peter to answer them. But one of them, this question of while reaching the 1.5 goal might be technically feasible, it seems that practically and politically it's impossible. Should we not research deep adaptation right now? I think that is a very legitimate question. For those of you who are maybe not familiar with the term of deep adaptation, essentially it is the question of whether we should not also look at what happens if we cannot manage to stabilize climate, if we really get into a mode where climate change continues and the temperature continues to rise. How do we handle that? How do we go about that? And I think that's a very legitimate thing to do. I think it does make sense to look into deep adaptation right now. If there was only one mind working, I would say let that mind work on solving the problem. But there's so many minds working, so there should be room for some minds looking also at this deep adaptation issue. And what I found for the part of myself that looked into deep adaptation is that many of the things we need to do to handle the situation when it comes as best as possible, which means to survive as well, comfortable is the wrong word, but as well as we can, and make it possible for as many people as possible in a good manner. I think many of the things we need to do for that are essentially the same we need to do in order to prevent getting into that situation. And I think that is very important. For instance, it means something we've also learned in this pandemic is not to rely too much on products that we get from the other end of the earth. We should make sure that within our reach, which then will be very small, a reach that is maybe defined by what we can reach by bicycle or maybe, I don't know, by horse. So it's not so huge distances. But that we within that field we find all the necessities of life, just the necessities, not all the pleasures, but the necessities. And if we do that, it means we concentrate on sufficiency, which is also something which occurs in the questions. And I think this sufficiency is an important aspect. We need to make do with less, which does not mean that we will be less happy. And I think this type of thinking that comes along with deep adaptation is something we really should be getting into in parallel to trying to make sure that we don't need it. Okay, I think this is now the time for Peter to take over. I think you've mastered the technical problems.
Yes, it's been a bit of a nightmare. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. And you can see my first slide.
Yes, exactly. I will leave you to it now.
Okay, well,
Perfect.
I apologize to everybody, wherever you are, for this delay. I'm a Safari user, but I had to switch to Chrome, and anyway, bit of a maze, but I think we're through it now. So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes talking to the title of this session, Economic Growth versus Climate Change. And then a very much related question, how can we prosper within the boundaries of our planet? I'm going to use some arithmetic examples and some simulation results of work that I've done on these topics. I'm an economist, but I've worked on environment for a long time, so I'm happy to share my thoughts with you. So the three parts to this very brief presentation, what I call the simple arithmetic of GDP and greenhouse gas emissions, GDP being gross domestic product, and its increases in gross domestic product that are conventionally used to measure economic growth. Then I want to make the point that climate change is a stock problem. I'll explain that more clearly in a moment. And then the third part will be on trying to answer the question about prosperity within planetary boundaries. I can't really answer that fully, but I can give you some clues. So here's the simple arithmetic of GDP and greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions, in the most simple way from an economist's point of view, are simply gross domestic product multiplied by greenhouse gas emissions per dollar, or whatever currency you want, but per dollar of gross domestic product. If you know those two on the right-hand side, you get what's on the left-hand side. So an important question is whether well, we know that greenhouse gas emissions increase with growth as GDP goes up, and you can see that in that simple equation. If that goes up and the GHG per dollar of GDP stays constant, then greenhouse gas emissions goes up. But if greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of GDP goes down, then greenhouse gas emissions will go down. So we have two things really working here in opposite directions. But a key question is whether, if the economy grows faster, does that in fact lower that what we call greenhouse gas intensity, or does it leave it the same, or does it go higher? What we're hearing now a lot in terms of the post-COVID recovery is that a lot of green investments will not only make the economy more efficient, but it'll increase economic growth. And when I hear that, I think that people don't understand that these actually can move easily in opposite directions. Here's some data for Canada. It's not particularly unusual. It shows that from 1990 to about 2004, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions were rising. That tells us that the rate of economic growth in Canada was faster than the rate of reduction in greenhouse gas per dollar, or greenhouse gas intensity. Then we reach this situation where the greenhouse gas emissions have more or less stabilized. So that this tells us that the rate of economic growth has been roughly equal to the rate of reduction in greenhouse gas intensity. So that interplay of those two variables is really important. So here's a little table that may help illustrate the importance of this. There on the top left is the equation I've just gone over with you. Let us suppose we're starting with 100 greenhouse gas emissions. Just 100 tons, that will be, or 1 million tons. Really doesn't matter for illustrative purposes. And let's say we set ourselves a target in 30 years to get that down to 0. Now, in the table on the right, and the columns show different rates of economic growth from 1% to 3% a year. And the vertical rows show the rate of reduction in greenhouse gas intensity. So let's just look at the first column. If the economy, whichever economy it is, it could be the country of your country, the world, a city, a state, it's very versatile, this. If the economy doesn't grow at all, then after 30 years, greenhouse gas emissions will be exactly the same if the intensity hasn't changed. But if the intensity has dropped by 1%, with no economic growth, greenhouse gas emissions will have dropped to 70. That's a 30% reduction. And you can see that the faster we grow, or the faster we reduce the intensity, the better the result will be in 30 years' time. It's got to go down very fast to get close to 0. These are all rounded. There'll still be a little bit left there. But if the economy grows at 1%, and we don't have any change in greenhouse gas emissions per dollar, then we're going to see a 42% increase in emissions. And if it grows at 1%, well, we're just about where we would have been if there'd been no growth. We've got to, the growth makes it harder. We've got to have a faster rate of reduction in intensity to get an equivalent level of greenhouse gas emissions. And it just gets worse and worse with 2% and 3%. So just to give you a little example, let us suppose that somebody comes along and says, we've got a way with green investment that's going to expand the economy, but it's going to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity. It expands the economy, but it doesn't expand it at a faster rate. But suppose that they claim it's also going to boost economic growth from 2% to 3%. You can see that we've gained virtually nothing from the 100 that we started from. So the interplay of these two variables, the rate of growth and the rate of efficiency improvement, whatever issue you're talking about, have to be taken always together. Now, my second point. Climate change, of course, is a stock problem. Helga made this clear when she talked about the accumulation of greenhouse gases, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere being a fundamental cause of climate change. But we tend to focus a lot, it's changing a little bit, on the annual flow of greenhouse gases and doing something about that. So I've taken a bit of a look at this. This is a graph which shows both greenhouse gas emissions and GDP measured as indexes. We're going to start with levels of 100 at the in the initial year 0. And we're going to strive for a 95% reduction in emissions over 30 years. Now, the economy, by assumption, is growing at 2% a year. Let's see what happens. Well, here we get GDP rising. That's our 2% a year. The economy is almost double what it was when we started. And here's emissions actually coming down. And so we just meet our target, given by the green line, in 30 years. This little dial shows us that to get that reduction in emissions, the emissions intensity has got to decline at over 11% a year, every year for 30 years. Well, it's never done that for 1 year, as far as I know, in any country. But still, that's what we'd have to do. But I've kept saying, haven't I, that we've really got to see this as a stock problem. Well, let us suppose that we have a carbon budget 10 times current emissions. In other words, some scientists, not myself, have estimated that we could put another 1,000, let's say, million tons into the atmosphere and stay within our target temperature increase of, say, 1.5 degrees. 10 times was the number that I came across 2 or 3 years ago when the IPCC published a report on this very question. Some people say there actually isn't any room left, and others say it's more than 10. But let's say 10 for the example. Well, now here's our budget, and this is the cumulative emissions now, rising towards it, but we don't exceed it. Things are looking good. We have another meter here. The year the budget is exceeded, but it doesn't exceed it. The total emissions over that period is 973 tons. So let me just recap. Economic growth of 2% a year, greenhouse gas intensity declining at 11.3% a year, results in cumulative emissions of this, and we stay within the budget. Now, same objectives, but let's suppose we approach it not by a nice exponential curve, as it is, but by a linear reduction. We still get to our target, but what does it mean for cumulative emissions? Well, it's not very good news. We'll have the same target of 10 times. We shoot through the budget in about 12 years, and the total emissions is much, much greater. What's that? Nearly 3 times what it was if we approach that with a constant reduction on a constant rate of reduction in greenhouse gas intensity. So you see, the path matters terrific, so much in this. Here's one last scenario. This is where we hope for a technological breakthrough. So here's what emissions look like, right? A steady decline, not very fast. Then we get the technological breakthrough in about 12 years' time, and we get down to almost a target right away. Well, let's look what that means for the cumulative emissions. We get through the budget in 10 years, and the total is just about the same as it was before. So my point here is very much that we've got to think of this as a stock problem, and we've got to think about the path of emissions between now and any point in the future where we hope to get emissions down to 0, because the path matters. This is another version of the planetary boundaries diagram. This also comes from Kate Raworth, and it shows the boundaries on the outside, and it shows a number of social, political, economic considerations on the inside. And what she's trying to persuade us is that we somehow got to live in this donut. The difficulty, not difficulty, but what we need to have an idea of is how thick is that donut? Does it have any thickness at all? Is it still feasible for the world, or for any individual country as part of the world, to get within that part of the donut? Well, one way to approach this is that we can think of that globally. Then we have to think about what it would mean for each continent, and then for each country. Well, I've chosen Canada because it's the country I know best. And one of the questions that we have if we're going to think about planetary boundaries is some way of thinking about apportioning access to those boundaries all the way down below the national level, down to the municipal, local level as well. And that work needs to be done, and needs to be done fast. Well, here's a photograph of my good friend Tim Jackson, who some of you hope will have heard of and heard him speak and read his stuff. And the two of us began collaborating on building a simulation model of a national economy, which is why I mentioned this before. This would be a national economy of Canada, although it's now in the process of being applied to other countries. And as you can see, our research objective was to explore alternative possible futures where we consider economic, financial, social, and environmental consideration. Now, I'm not saying we consider them all, but we were quite ambitious. I can't tell you in detail about the model. I'll leave the last slide I have give you some information where you can find out more. But I'm just going to describe 3 of the scenarios that we ran for Canada. A base case, which simply says if current trends as of just before the pandemic were to continue for another 50 years, what would be the outcome? If we focus very heavily on carbon, we put a very stiff price on carbon emissions from electric power. We have a very stringent set of regulations to get the non-electricity industry to control their emissions, and we electrify road and rail transport. That's quite an ambitious carbon reduction program. That's the second scenario. And the third is our sustainable prosperity scenario, where we add to number 2 a net zero carbon emissions target. We switch very much from conventional, what we call brown investment, which is primarily profit driven, to green investment, which is primarily environmentally driven. We increase transfer payments to reduce income inequality and reduce poverty. We reduce the rate of population growth, or we assume a slower one, however you want to put that. And we bring in reduced work hours, because that's, A, improves people's lives, usually, and secondly, it can help maintain full employment, even if the economy is not growing fast or even shrinking. So we've got loads of results from this model. I'm just going to show you 3 here. Here's the GDP results. So the base case shows you the black line. The growth is fastest if we succeed. I don't think we will, but if we were to succeed in following the historical path, that's where we would end up. If we go for our carbon reduction scenario, our model suggests that will actually slow the rate of economic growth. And if we go for sustainable prosperity, we actually end up with no economic growth, growth being measured by gross domestic product. Here's the carbon emissions that go along with those scenarios. The base case is awful. Greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions, the same thing, go up. Here's the carbon reduction scenario. It's ambitious. It doesn't get us to net zero. And here's the sustainable prosperity scenario where we go further. And here we have a graph that shows you 2 things, both the total material that comes into the Canadian economy and all of the different ways it's disposed of, which Helga briefly described in what we call a Sankey diagram, showing the small role that recycling plays and so on. Well, the model that we have, unlike virtually any other economic model you might see or hear about, checks and calculates where all the materials come from and how they're used. And that's why this graph shows both, because everything that comes in has to be disposed of one way or the other, either as a product that's kept in the economy or as a waste that goes out of it. So how do we compare these scenarios? Well, we can look at many graphs like this. Some make one scenario look better than the other, but we want to get an overall picture. So we invented the Sustainable Prosperity Index. Now, the significant thing about the index is that all of the variables you can see here, like gross domestic product per capita, the unemployment rate, and all the way down here, they are all calculated in the model. So it's not just of things we'd like to know about, it's things that we can actually estimate the value of in the different scenarios. And we combine those into a single Sustainable Prosperity Index. The plus sign indicates that when this variable goes up, GDP per capita, we count that as a benefit. When these go up, unemployment, inequality, government debt to GDP, and so on, all the way down to our environmental burden index, we count those as negative. So we've got some positives and negatives happening here. So now let me show you the Sustainable Prosperity Index for the 3 scenarios. Here's the base case. This is what Canada could look forward to if we were able to, as they say, get back on track and continue on the path we were on before the pandemic came. This is not a happy future. The carbon reduction scenario is better. It's still a deterioration, but not a huge one. And the Sustainable Prosperity scenario makes things look even better still. So that's very promising. Well, so we can prosper, perhaps, within planetary boundaries if we redefine prosperity, as Helga was already emphasizing in her remarks, and I would endorse that, and we choose a different path. But it won't be an old character like this in the picture or an old geezer looking at you or speaking to you right now who's actually going to make those choices. It'll be a lot of work for the next generations. So my final slide, there's the cover of my book where I tell you pretty much what I just told you, but I take something like 300 pages to do it. There's an article in Ecological Economics that Tim and I wrote, which described the model, or we wrote and describes the model. And here's a more detailed working paper. And if you go to ISEE Exchange, you just Google that, it'll take you to an opportunity to run the models. Just put in my name and you'll get access to the models. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and look forward to your questions, comments, and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your inputs as well. And now we can also call back Helga. Helga, if you want to join us for the Q&A section. Yes, Helga is here. Great. I'm sure the audience has many questions, but maybe you could start off by commenting on each other's presentations if you have any comments.
Well, if I may start, thank you very much, Peter, for this presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think you showed with the model something which I sort of think that intuitively one also, if one works with it, one also can see. People often say that the Sustainable Development Goals, I don't want to discuss whether they are ideal or not, but if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, in addition to the Paris Climate Agreement, for instance, this does not make the thing more complex, but it opens more options, more possibilities. And I think that is also what your model shows, that if you add more issues, than just GDP and carbon emissions, for instance, then suddenly you get more possible paths, and they can really help you to achieve more than you would achieve otherwise. I think that is. I hope I did not misunderstand the model in that it also shows this. And there's
no, I think you understand it. Sorry. Well, I was going to say, I think you understand it very well. I write, and I have done for some time now, under this heading of managing without growth for a very deliberate reason. I've been involved in environmental issues, many different capacities for a long time. And very often I've heard that when somebody comes up with a good idea, it could be something simple like protecting wetlands. Good idea. But we can't really do that because that would slow down economic growth. And I just felt it was important as an economist to really explore as well as I could. Do we actually need to put economic growth at the top of our policy priorities and push it aside and focus on the things that we really want to improve? Because the growth in GDP has been said many times for a long, long time. Robert Kennedy did it in his famous speech in 1968, and the people before that. But it still dominates policy making and policy thinking. So as you say, once you don't focus so much on just that one metric, and you ask what are all the things we're really interested in, it opens our brain, opens our mind to alternatives.
Peter,
one other comment, if I may. I mean, this being the 10th of March, and we're just one day off from the 10-year anniversary, it's not a nice word, of the Fukushima accident or catastrophe. I think your model on this technological breakthrough is a clear picture that it does not help to believe that in 10 years' time we will have the safe and great and clean and so on and cheap nuclear energy. Even if we did have, it would not solve our problem. And we won't have it before that in any case, even if you're a fan for nuclear. I mean, even Bill Gates says he will take 5 years at least to produce his prototype. So hoping for future technologies, it might also be carbon capture and storage, hoping for future technologies that are not available now is not a solution to the climate issue. It doesn't mean you shouldn't look at them, but it's not a solution.
Yes, and of course, that's what we've been doing for a long time. That's really been, that's in a way been the main strategy, not change what we do, how we live, what we think is important and so on, what we mean by prosperity and how we pursue it, but let's try to keep everything pretty much as is and solve our problems with technology. But it's in many respects technology that's got us into the problem. So I agree absolutely with you. It's just it's very unfortunate. But you know, this is reflective of a mindset which first says growth is always good, and B, that technology can always solve our problems. Both of those, they've been questioned, but we really have to question them hard. I do have a question for you, I think. You talked about acceptable limits. And that is immediately says acceptable to whom? How is that acceptability to be established? It's not something you can get from science. You need scientific input, but it's not a scientific notion as to what's acceptable. There's the question of, when I say acceptable to whom, how do we bring the rights or the interests of other species into that consideration and so on? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think we don't need to answer that question, because getting into hothouse Earth is certainly not acceptable. I don't think we need to discuss this. But taking us into a situation where the climate continues to change without our being able to do anything about it is I don't think there's anybody who says, well, that is a situation we want to get into. And the limit before, at least as far as science can tell now, that is there's so little time before we get there, and so little temperature difference before we get there. So all the other limits are beyond that. So it's really this urgency that saves us the problem of answering those other questions. Because of that urgency, we have to act now.
Can I just add one little point, though? You did put up the planetary boundaries diagram, which has 9 boundaries. Climate is the easiest one in a way to answer in the way you did, but some of the others don't lend themselves to that kind of ready answer. Well, there's a fairly definite point we know we don't want to go beyond, and so I think the question of acceptability, if you're talking about biodiversity, for example, there were remarks made probably in the introduction. I think Aliki made them about the global south versus the global north and so on, and the distribution of biodiversity is so very different and so on, and the dependency on biodiversity is different in those places. So acceptability then has to be brought down from sort of some global picture to something more local, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. I think the issue with those boundaries are, of course, that these are definitions given by science, but they are not necessarily the ones that are acceptable to people. I mean, for instance, biodiversity, it's a question, the limits put there, the boundaries put there are the rate of loss of species, and they are compared to previous events. But that is not necessarily what people would accept or not accept.
Right.
And I think that is, I think it's an enormously helpful concept to work with from a scientific point of view, but it is not necessarily what really helps us in political decisions. And therefore, I think, I think it's an open question. And the question is whether this limit we're reaching, or this urgency of climate, if we react on that, if we automatically also solve the other problems. I think for some of it it's true. Possibly not for all of them. Of course, there are also trade-offs, and we must keep the limits in mind when we discuss those trade-offs.
If I can, I would like to interject now very quickly with some questions from the audience. Sorry, Helga, I tried to speak over you earlier. There is one question especially that has gone quite crazy on Slido, and that is a question for Peter. Specifically, whether you support degrowth and what the difference between managing without growth and degrowth is. And the other question that has a lot of votes is whether a no-growth economy and capitalism are compatible. I know this is a question you love, and maybe Helga also, you can, if you have any inputs on this. So if we have an economy that is not growing, is that, have we moved past capitalism?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this question of degrowth and growth generally, it gets very complicated very fast, because we have to be clear on what it is we're talking about is growing, and degrowing. If we understand that as shrinking, then we've got to talk about what's shrinking. Now, I understand also that degrowth is more than simply a call for things to get smaller. It's a broad-based critique of the growth paradigm and even of capitalism. So there's many interwoven ideas there. But bringing it back to my own perspective, it's because I've already said that so much of the world's policies are driven by a desire to see GDP grow. I wanted to see, could we manage without GDP growth? If I'm asked, well, what
isn't
will
that
that mean
degrowth? Isn't that just
sorry?
degrowth? Isn't that just degrowth? If you
but degrowth is more than just a change in GDP.
Okay.
In fact, they'll tell you, and I've written on degrowth a little bit and been to the conferences and so on, that it's a broad-based social political commentary on a growth-based society. And if we were to move to the sort of situation they're talking about, then probably GDP would grow more slowly, but it would probably be also not paid much attention to. But the degrowth we really need, thinking about it as reduction, is in the use of materials and energy, and hence disposal of waste, and land use change. In fact, we've got to reverse land use change. That's one of the reasons why I showed that one graph of the materials input and disposition. And only in the sustainable prosperity scenario do we actually see an absolute decline in materials required for the economy to run in the way that we represented it in that scenario. So, let's not worry too much about growth in GDP. I mean, it's a number that will be useful to economists, for example, for estimating tax revenues. I'm not saying it doesn't have a role to play, but not as a primary policy objective, which is supposed to answer all problems. If you want to know my view, we should be putting caps on the limits. We should putting limits rather on the amount of materials and energy we allow ourselves to extract from the biosphere. At the moment, most of that policy would be national. So this would have to be done at the national level, but it could be part of a larger agreement. And the same with land use. Countries are, like Canada, is trying to protect more land. It's very slow, but we're doing something. So we are kind of moving in that direction. Let me just briefly talk about the second question, shall I? Capitalism and no growth. I don't have the complete answer to that, but one of the interesting things about the model is it teaches you things you didn't even think about when you start. So well into the work, Tim and I decided to think, well, what does the model tell us about that question? For example, what happens to the rate of profit in the sustainable prosperity scenario? If the rate of profit was to go to zero, because profit's calculated and capital is calculated, we just can calculate the rate of profit. If we just didn't know. Oh, does it go to zero? If it goes to zero, then clearly capitalism is not compatible with that. Well, it doesn't go to zero. It declines a bit. It doesn't go to zero. Isn't that interesting? Capital share of income doesn't change dramatically. Now, that doesn't mean that owners of capital would like to see the rate of profit decline or are satisfied with their share of national income. So there would be tremendous resistance, and there is, to the kind of changes that I'm talking about. But it's not because there's just based on what I've said, some fundamental feature of having some of the means of production privately owned in an economy, which is fundamental to the definition of capitalism, that the economy has to grow. We've done work on banking as well connected to that, but I won't go into that. That's enough.
Helga, would you like to add anything, or do you think the discussion on capitalism and degrowth is maybe not relevant, or what we call it, a-growth or degrowth? Mm-hmm.
I think it's very relevant, but it's not my field of expertise. I mean, I'm an ardent student of what happens in this field, because obviously, with as a natural scientist, if you just stop with natural sciences, your contribution to the solution is very limited. So I think you have to work to also look at these other issues. What my impression is that capitalism is a very sort of a concept that is very good at changing its shape and gobbling up new ideas without changing anything in the basic structure. And I think I feel that is one of the dangers, that some of the attempts to solve our problems will be appropriated by a capitalist system and made to turn around, to become the opposite of what the original intent was. And we see some of those things in things that maybe would be good for society if they were not misused for private gains. And to a big extent, this is, for instance, carbon capture, ETS, trading carbon credits. You could say that's a good means to give it a cap for trade, and the cap reduces, and that means emissions become more expensive, and so people reduce their emissions. But now we're starting to use that to commodify these emissions, and that makes no sense. People make money out of an instrument that is intended to reduce emissions, and by making money out of that, reduce the efficiency of that instrument. I think it's one example. There's many.
So I'd just like to add to something that might have said before. The kind of measures that I think we have to take and implement to deal with the range of problems that we're looking at, the planetary boundary problems and the social and economic ones, if we take those measures, capitalism will become unrecognizable. It won't be because at some point we all of a sudden get together and say, let's get rid of capitalism and switch to some other different society. I don't think that's likely to happen. And I certainly don't want to bet on it happening and wait for it to happen. But I do think that the kind of restraint that I've mentioned will be resisted by owners of capital, particularly in countries where the resources are owned. In Canada, most of the resources are actually owned by the state. Most land in Canada is owned by the state, public land. It's quite different from the US. So there's different potentials in different countries. I'm not saying it's dead easy in Canada either, but it's different structure. And I think imposing the kind of limits we need to avoid transgressing the planetary boundaries will be a huge challenge to capitalism and will change it. And maybe 50 years from now, people will look back and say, well, what they had then is not what we've got now. Give it a different name.
Thanks very much for those answers. I would now actually ask the public if they want to take part in the Q&A, and they can come on stage and share their camera and microphone. So we had some people already trying to join earlier. If there's anyone that would like to ask a question, then you can do that now. I don't see anyone at the moment. Okay, Sasha is trying to join, so I can give the floor to Sasha now.
Yes, Helga, thank you very much. Can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, we.
Yes, well, thank you so very much to both Helga and Peter. This is wonderful. I've read some of your work and much appreciate. My question is around governance. What kind of governance is going to help us go from where we are today, somehow stuck in the old ways, into what we all know we need to do? And how are we going to get from current governance to the new governance that we need?
Great. Maybe, is it okay if we take a couple of questions also from some other audience members, and then you guys can think of your answer until then. And now next is Marie Safre.
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Good.
Hi.
I had posted 2 questions in the Slido about countries having debt always, which is like what is like happening right now, that most countries like have to have a debt to be like, I don't know, I don't really know why they have to have a debt, but yeah, it's my thought is that would we need to have a debt if we were in a stable economy? Would there be need for a debt because growth and debt, like whatever. And the second was about energy deficit, since Helga and Peter talked about nuclear energy for a while. I remembered this fact that the world is probably going to be in need of way more energy than we are using right now, and renewables might not be enough for that. Yes, those are my two questions.
We don't hear you.
So we have one more. Is it okay if we take one more audience question from Benjamin, and then we can answer the first round?
Hi there. I hope you can hear me. My question is also in the chat, and thanks to Professor Victor and Professor Kromp-Kolb. I've read a couple of your pieces as well. Thank you very much. And also for the very interesting panel discussion. So the question that's in the chat: if we don't use GDP growth as an indicator for well-being and for human development, which other indicators would exist to replace it? I think that's that would be my question.
Okay.
Thanks very much, Benjamin.
So is it over to us now?
It's over to you. Maybe Peter, you can start us off. And then Helga.
Maybe I'll start with the last one first. In some ways, it's the easiest. There are many proposed alternative measures of well-being. There's quite an interesting debate about whether you can get away with simply one. That Sustainable Prosperity Index that I showed you briefly would be one such composite indicator. The problem with such an indicator like that is you have to ask, how have we added these different things together? What weight has been given to each one? If you give different weight, if you change the weights, you get a different result. So others have proposed what they call a dashboard, multiple indicators, one for inequality, one for life expectancy, one for some or several environmental measures. But then you've still got the problem of how do you assess how you're doing? Now, people would say, well, if you're driving even a car, you've got multiple instruments that you use to determine how well you're doing, how well the car's running. So why we don't necessarily need a single indicator. The point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of work that's gone on in this. There was a great report done in 2009 by Stiglitz and Sen and Fitoussi. It's online. It was a very good comprehensive comparison of different alternatives. And so that's really not the problem of a lack of alternatives or other metrics. It's but I think it's important that we keep pushing them forward, because no one's going to walk away from GDP if there's absolutely nothing to replace it. It's a mediocre measure of welfare, well-being, but we can do better. So I think that would be how I would answer that. Oh, just one final one, I suppose. One of the more famous such measures, if you can see this, in For the Common Good by Daly and Cobb from 1994. In the back, they have their human index of sustainable economic well-being. This was the basis for what later became the Genuine Progress Index. And one of the reasons why this is popular in some places is everything gets measured in money. And so you can add it up and you can compare it with GDP, and that's what they do. And they show, well, GDP increased in all these countries, but this index didn't thrive so well at all. Helga, do you want to answer? There was one on energy in particular. Okay. I thought.
Yeah, I can answer on energy. I think our highest priority in terms of energy must be higher energy efficiency to make sure that we use energy in a more sensible way. There's some statistics which show, for instance, that in cars are extremely inefficient because they move much more mass than as the car than what they really transport. And besides that, they usually are not moving at all. They stand somewhere. People talk about 95% of the time, on the average, cars stand in Europe. So I think the main issue, use energy for what we really needed and not waste the energy. The other aspect, there was sort of the indication renewables will not be enough. We will need nuclear. Well, if you look at nuclear, nuclear needs a lot of energy right at the start. To build that nuclear power plant uses very, very much energy, because you need a lot of concrete, you need a lot of steel, you need a lot of energy right in the beginning. So if you build a lot of nuclear power plants at the same time, or one after the other, you're running into a huge energy deficit. And only over a very long time can you sort of replace that deficit. So nuclear energy is no solution if you're thinking of an energy deficit, that because we need more energy. I think the basic thing is we need to increase our efficiency, maybe also reduce the energy we need overall in the industrialized nations. I'm not talking about developing nations. Developing nations will need some additional energy, of course, but they should leapfrog, which means immediately go over to renewable energies. And renewable energies can be scaled up very fast. So I don't think that is really the issue. That is certainly not an argument for nuclear.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a very brief question about
the governance issue has not been answered. I admit I don't really have a good answer. The only thing I'm quite certain of is that we will not be able to handle the transitions that are necessary if we do not involve the people. So whatever the governance is, it will have to have a very strong participatory component at different levels. But it is not we will not be able to manage the transition in an autocratic manner. That might be helpful in the short term, but there will be a lot of resistance against these autocratic measures in the medium term and in the long term, and that will put pressure on achieving the goals. So Peter, maybe you have some.
Yeah, can I add a couple of comments? Let me just say on the efficiency proposal, I'm fine with more efficiency, but we have to watch the rebound effect, as I'm sure you're aware of. You make things more efficient, it has a way of making them cheaper. It makes something cheaper, people do more of it. And so that's why caps on amount of materials that we use have to be in place to protect us against the rebound effect. On governance, again, you've heard our credentials when we were introduced. I'm not a political scientist, so I can't answer it in that sort of learned academic way. But what I will say is this: I've given talks on the idea of managing without growth for a long time now, and quite a lot to either government people or people who work for governments at different levels. And what I've found is that the receptivity is greatest at the local level and least well received at the federal or even international level. And so there's a lesson there, and I think it supports what Helga was saying, I'm happy to say, and that is that if people are given or take more control over their local environments and are actively involved in the politics required to do that, I think that's all to the good. And I do think some of that will filter up to the more senior levels of government. Let me just say something about debt, because somebody asked about debt in a stable economy. First of all, I don't have any problem with debt. It depends what the debt is for. So taking out a mortgage or buying a house in the old-fashioned way, there's nothing wrong with that, because you're taking on debt in order to acquire an asset. If you take on debt, however, just to live a high consumption lifestyle, and then you can't keep up with the payments, and you're exposed to 10-20% a year interest on that, that's not good at all. And so, but debt, wanting to spend more money than your current income, recognizing that at some future point you'll be spending less money than your current income when you repay the debt, that's not a bad thing in itself. But I am going to take another tack on this, because we hear it's a bit like the attention given to GDP. We governments give a lot of attention to the debt to GDP ratio. That is, how much debt has a government got, and I'm talking and how much is the GDP. Now, there's a very I happen to be sitting next to my library, so I'm going to show you the books that I like. This is a fairly new book called The Deficit Myth by a very bright economist, Stephanie Kelton, and she identifies with this new theory of money called modern money theory. And she makes a very important distinction between money users, which is us and businesses, and lower levels of government, and money creators. Now, a lot of Europeans here, and I'm not up to date on the European banking system, but in a country like Canada, our government, our federal government, essentially owns the bank, owns the central bank, the Bank of Canada. And so when you own a bank, it gives you options that you don't have when you're a money user, because your bank can create money. Now, the odd thing is that even governments that own banks oblige themselves not to borrow from their own bank more than they have to. They have to borrow from the commercial banks and end up paying interest to the commercial banks for money that they could have had access to for nothing. And so the modern money theorists say two things. One is, don't worry about debt at the federal level, the national level, if you have a bank that you own at that level. And I think in Europe it's a bit different with your banking system there. And there was a second point, I've forgotten it. But anyway, you just don't have to worry about debt in the same way as if you are running a household. This is the key thing. A lot of the sort of the media talk about government debt is, or you hear from politicians, they, well, now look, if you were running your household, you'd be very worried if you took on too much debt. And they think that logic applies to a federal government that owns a bank. If I had a printing press in my basement, I'd have a very different attitude to spending money than because I have to earn it.
But I think what that shows is that the monetary system really needs some sort of workover. I think this in Europe, I think it's different. Some of the countries do own banks and others don't. In some cases, like the US, it's a private institution. The Fed is a private institution. So that is not the same everywhere. Europe has the additional problem of the European bank, which sort of makes things even more complex. But I think to stay within this system is one of the issues that really needs discussions. And I think there are discussions going on. But they're not, they haven't reached the level yet that they need to reach, and they certainly haven't reached. There's no action taken yet, and I think that would be very necessary.
Maybe if I can bring us back a little bit to the main topic of living within the planetary boundaries. We've had quite a few questions in the Slido from the audience about specifically what we can do, or specifically action that we can take. So both of you have quite a bit of experience in this field. So why are we in the situation where we are, and what can we do as people to change things?
Well, I think one of the main things, if I look back, what has made the biggest difference over the last 30 years in our thinking, or in the public perception of the problem, I think that was the Fridays for Future movement. And Fridays for Future has a big strike day on the 19th of March. And I think helping them, supporting them is one of the things everyone can do. And certainly in many countries, this is not connected to any risk. So I think that is something we can do. That will not solve the problem, but it will help us get attention in order to be able to solve the problem. And I think at least I can say for Europe, I can certainly say for Austria, we had a very interesting experience in Austria, which just by chance, it really was an experiment. We had elections for government, for Austrian government, and the climate issue was no issue in those elections at all. And then the Friday for Future movement came, and through something totally unrelated to climate, we had elections again 1 year later. So 1 year after Fridays for Future started, we had elections again. And suddenly the main topic in the whole election campaign was climate change. And it completely changed the government, also for other reasons. But there is now a government program with a lot of climate issues. And I think that is something that was only achieved in this manner. Wolfgang, kannst du abreden, bitte?
So let me just add a little bit, if I may. I would answer this question about what we can do in a couple of different ways. First of all, what can you do as an individual? Educating ourselves is very important. It doesn't matter how long you've been at this. There's so much to learn. So make sure you are well informed. Secondly, there are actions you can take as an individual. I think it's really unsatisfactory to say one thing and live a different way. So you need to try and find a reconciliation between your beliefs about what's important, what you would like everyone to do, and to try to do that for yourself. But of course, that alone is not enough. We also have to work in groups. And so identifying and finding a group or group that you want to work with, want to be part of, whether that's an environmental group, a political party, some sort of professional organization. It all depends upon, you know, what's happening in the rest of your life. But get involved in a group. It could be a religious group, and then through group action, and then the groups working as an alliance. One of the organizations I've taken a real shine to is the Wellbeing Alliance. Hasn't been around that long, but it's a network of organizations all working on this notion of well-being, and it's having some influence at government levels now in several smaller countries. So there's such a range of things that we have to do, but you can't let it take up your whole life. Well, you can, but you probably won't survive. That's the only thing. You have to some balance. One other thing I would just add, and this is always a dilemma for me at any rate, the issues that we're talking about have ranged very widely already. They're not just the broad palette of environmental issues, but social, north-south relations, inequality, those sorts of things. If you spread yourself too thinly, if you worry about them all, it can become quite debilitating and you never actually do anything. So we somehow have to choose a focus as well as being open to the broader currents that are going on around us. Well, I hope that's of some use.
Maybe I could add one thing. You said don't let them take up your whole life. I think it's also important to realize that you are not alone responsible for saving the world. Yes. You can contribute, but you will never succeed to be the one person who saves the world. And I think to take some of that load of responsibility off many shoulders is important. I think it's important to contribute, but it's also important to realize what your own role can be and what it can't be.
I like what Yorgos Kallis says. He says that you can live with up to 4 to 8 contradictions, or 4 to 10 contradictions. If you have fewer contradictions in your life than 4, then you are crazy. And if you have more than 10 contradictions, you're a hypocrite. But to live a normal life in this society, 4 to 10 contradictions are okay. And I think that's maybe a good measure. I've just noticed the time now that we are already running a little bit behind, and we unfortunately didn't have any more time for open questions from the audience. But as the audience knows, there will be a chance for networking after this session is over. So please don't go anywhere. Please stay. And there will be, it's a little bit like chat roulette. You will have 3 minutes with participants. And as I've heard that Helga and Peter will also stick around. So it will be a little bit like at the end of a talk in real life. But Helga and Peter, thank you so much for all of your really, really interesting inputs. Maybe now, if you would both like to make a closing statement for the discussion, and then to take part in the networking session afterwards. Maybe Helga would like to go first, if you're ready. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for having me here. Thank you for the questions, and Peter, thank you very much for your talk. I think we have seen that there's very different approaches to the same problem, and we have also seen that the problems we have discussed today are just a very small sector of all the problems that are out there. But I think it's important to, as we said, focus on something and then try to help solve those issues that are in your focus. And I think there's ample opportunity for each and every one of us to do something in their field, and I think it's the opportunity is for the individual. The opportunity is also for the individual in their in their work surroundings, in their friends' surroundings. So I think we have a lot of opportunities, and we should make use of those, because the issues are really relevant, and they will determine the future of civilization, essentially. And if we don't want to go that far, at least the future of our children and our grandchildren and their offspring. So I think it's really worth fighting for a better future. And I think we are well equipped to do that. And we still have to learn a lot, but there's no reason to wait until we know everything. I think we have enough knowledge to really get started on the changes that are necessary. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate and to meet Helga for the first time. It's been feel very privileged to do that. I don't think I really have any final words except to say that one of the spin-offs from this COVID is the frequency with which we are now talking to one another around the world about issues of common interest. And I hope that this will not just continue, but will thrive after this horrible pandemic is over. Because I think there's a certain loneliness that we can be subject to pursuing these kinds of ideas. We can talk to people who are like-minded, but I had the experience of stepping out of the classroom. I used to teach in the classroom, and then going to a shopping mall and just thinking I've entered a completely different world. That the people in one place have no interest to share with the people in the other. And breaking down those boundaries or those barriers, I think, is a major task. And I hope that some of you, at any rate, will go away from this discussion today with new ideas about how to do that, and new arguments to make, and new points to make, new principles to advocate. So I wish you all good luck. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of you, and I'm sure there will be many things to take away for the participants. Okay, from my side, yeah, again, thanks to both of you for your inputs. And now we can maybe move on to the networking side. So as I understand, we just have to click on the net.